Well, in that context, what about the laws of nature? As soon as you begin to question the idea of laws of nature, you see, as I've just mentioned, that this is a very anthropomorphic metaphor. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized humans have laws, and tribal people have customs. Francis Bacon, who was Lord Chancellor of England and a lawyer, was the first person to make this idea of laws of nature a popular concept, and it fitted with his legal background and legal way of thinking. But does it really make sense to say that all the laws of nature were fixed at the moment of the Big Bang, and they've been the same ever since, the same at all times and in all places? Most scientists still take this assumption for granted, not because they've thought about it, but largely because they haven't. It's simply part of the scientific way of thinking to take eternal laws for granted. That's the reason that scientists are so insistent that any experiment should be repeatable anywhere by anyone, because the laws of nature are supposed to be the same at all times and in all places. But is this really the case? In an evolving universe, does it make sense to say that all the laws were there at the very beginning, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code? Well, most scientists still assume that, and they assume that the laws came into being with the universe. And as my friend Terence McKenna said, this is the one free miracle. Most scientists say, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. Well, you can believe in that miracle if you like, but it's an act of faith, and no one was around at the moment of the Big Bang to measure the laws of nature. Even if a human had existed, they would have instantly evaporated at billions of degrees centigrade. So there was no possibility of any direct observation. I think it makes much more sense to think of the regularities of nature as habits, as evolving habits. This idea was proposed at the beginning of the 20th century by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce, who proposed that the cosmos is evolving long before it became orthodox within science, and that the evolving cosmos would have habits, and that these habits would evolve along with nature. That implies that nature has a memory. You can't have habits without some kind of memory. A number of cosmologists have begun to consider this idea now. Smolin, a theoretical physicist based in Canada, is also talking about the habits of nature, what he calls the principle of precedence. Once something's happened once, it makes it easier to happen again. The quantum physicist David Bohm thought in terms of a kind of memory in nature through what he called the implicate order. A hidden order that underlies the world we experience, which picks up memories from everything that's happened, and this influences the way that things happen in the future. My own interpretation of this is in my hypothesis of morphic resonance, the idea that patterns of activity, of self-organizing activity, when they're repeated, resonate across time with similar patterns in the past. All self-organizing systems are vibratory, from electrons, atoms, crystals, cells, organisms, planets with their annual cycles, the sun with its many cycles. All living systems are vibratory. There are even great waves passing through the galaxy. And these vibratory systems, I'm suggesting, resonate across time from the past to the present. Meaning that everything has a kind of memory, every self-organizing system. I shall talk later about the effects this has on biological heredity and on the memories of social groups. But for now, I'm just going to talk about memory in the physical realm. According to conventional science, where everything's supposed to be governed by eternal laws, when you make a new chemical compound and crystallize it for the first time, the laws that govern the crystals should have been present from the beginning of the universe, the laws of electromagnetism, the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of quantum theory, and therefore the crystal should form the same way the first time you make it as the millionth time you make it or the billionth time you make it, because the laws are the same everywhere. But according to the principle of habit, then the first time you make it, there won't be a habit for that chemical crystallizing. It will never have happened in nature before. And the second time you make it somewhere else in the world, there might be an influence by morphic resonance from the first crystals, making it easier to crystallize again. The third time there'd be an influence from the first and the second crystals. The fourth time from the first, second, and third crystals. There'd be a cumulative build-up of influence, and this should make it easier to crystallize, which would mean you wouldn't have to wait so long for the crystals to form. But it's well known that chemists often have to wait months, even years, before new compounds will crystallize. But once they've crystallized, they get easier to crystallize all over the world. And the more often they're crystallized, the easier this gets. There's a lot of evidence in the chemical literature that this happens, and sometimes it proves a terrible nuisance. Sometimes when people make synthetic chemicals that are used in the drug industry, like ritonavir, which is one of the drugs used for treating AIDS, the chemical crystallizes in one way at first, and then a new form of the crystal appears in one factory and soon is present everywhere in the world. It's called a crystal polymorph, an alternative form of the crystal, and it spreads. Chemists don't want it to spread, but suddenly it's everywhere, and it's like a new fashion takes over. And this can cause losses of hundreds of millions of dollars to drug companies. So they're very aware of this process of spreading crystallization, and it's been studied considerably. But the usual assumption is that this happens because fragments of previous crystals, which can serve as nuclei for new crystallization processes or seeds, get spread around the world as dust particles, invisible dust particles. That's conceivable, but they've never taken into account the possibility of morphic resonance. And I suggest that the same thing would happen even if you filter dust particles out of the atmosphere in a laboratory, and even if you stop any other sources of contamination. Another prediction of morphic resonance concerns melting points. As crystals become more habitual, as the crystal form, the lattice structure of the crystal, becomes more established as a habit, it's harder to break the crystals up. The crystals become more stable. And the stability of compounds is what affects their melting point. The more stable they are, the higher the temperature you need to break them up. So morphic resonance and the habits of nature ideas would suggest that with new chemical compounds, not only do they get easier to crystallize, but also their melting point should increase. And actually, it's fairly well known to chemists as a matter of anecdotal observation that melting points of new compounds do increase. I recently, with the help of a Canadian chemist, did a survey of more than 150 newly synthesized chemicals that were first made in the 20th century to look at the changes in their melting points over time, over subsequent decades. And the results, which are shown here, are pretty conclusive. If melting points were measured with errors, you'd expect some to be too low, some to be too high, errors to go in either direction. And yet, over time, the changes in melting points that were observed were almost all in the direction of increased melting points. Some of them, the melting points went up by 5 degrees centigrade, some by 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 degrees centigrade. A few went down, and those might indeed be random errors, but it's quite clear that there's a very, very strong bias in favor of increased melting points. Now, this increase in melting points could possibly have another explanation, When I point this out to chemists, most of them would prefer to avoid morphic resonance because it's very controversial. It goes against one of the fundamental assumptions or dogmas of science. And so what they say, almost always come up with this explanation, is, well, we know that impurities lower melting points, and that's certainly true. That's why if you add salt to ice, you can make the ice thaw in the winter on roads or paths, because the impurity of the salt lowers the melting point of water, of ice. It lowers the melting point, so the ice is no longer frozen. What they say is that as time goes on, chemists may get better at making the crystals, at synthesizing the compounds, producing purer samples, which therefore have higher melting points. When I ask them, well, how do you know they're purer? They say, well, they must be purer because they've got higher melting points. In other words, so far, it's a circular argument. This could be tested rigorously in laboratories. I've tried to persuade chemists to do this, but most of them, well, they've all been too afraid to do this. Even when I found ones that were willing to do it, the head of the lab has stopped them doing it, saying this would open a can of worms in chemistry, and I don't want the can of worms opened in my laboratory. So there's another way of looking at this. The experimental method would be best, and I'm sure it will happen sooner or later. But another way of looking at this same question is through melting points of compounds that crystallize in nature and have done for millions of years. For example, salicin, which is in willow bark and crystallizes in dried willow bark. And when it's been around for millions of years, you wouldn't expect any change now. The habits should be so well established, a groove of habits so deep that it doesn't change. And indeed, with salicin, if we look at melting points from 1914 to 1996, there was no change in the melting point of salicin. But if we look at a synthetic compound, acetyl salicylic acid, otherwise known as aspirin, that was synthesized in the late 19th century. It's an unnatural chemical and is widely used as a drug. And over the 20th century, between 1914 and 1996, the melting point increased by at least 8 degrees centigrade. Now, I haven't got data from the 19th century, but I'd predict, and indeed when I have time I shall look for these data, and mostly in obscure German chemical publications, because I would predict the melting point would be even lower in the 19th century, soon after it was first synthesized. So I think that habits build up in nature at the chemical level, in all self-organizing systems, at the biological level, and those play a major part in biological inheritance and underlie the inheritance of form and instincts, as I shall discuss in a future episode. And I think, in fact, they underlie the whole of nature. Habits make more sense than laws. It's not as if laws are totally common sense. If you believe in the laws of nature, you have to believe in a transcendent realm, essentially mathematical and mind-like, which is beyond space and time, outside the natural world. Chemists and physicists don't find laws of nature. You don't sort of look through a telescope and see a law of nature. These are abstract, mathematical, transcendent realities outside space and time. Instead, I'm suggesting that there are habits that build up in nature because nature has a memory. This is a testable proposition, and I'll come back to it in future discussions.
Find out more on advire.life.